Hello and welcome. Thailand has a new king. Crown Prince Maha Vajiralongkorn has accepted the throne following a formal invitation from the country's military-led government. Well, it comes 50 days after the death of his father, King Bhumibol Adulyadej, the world's longest reigning monarch. Well, the delay was to give the Thai people time to mourn the late king, a much revered symbol of stability during the 7 decades of political turmoil in the country. His successor will also be known as King Rama X, in a dynasty dating back to 1782. His coronation only will take place after his father's cremation next year. From Bangkok, here's Jonathan Head.
After an unexpected 7-week delay, Thailand's royal succession got back on track. The foremost senior officials in the country read out a formal invitation to Crown Prince Vajiralongkorn to take the throne. At the age of 64, the man who's been destined his whole life to take on this role accepted to fulfill his father's wish, he said, and to ensure the well-being of the Thai people. He then paid his respects to King Bhumibol, whose 70-year-long reign has shaped the modern monarchy. Temples then marked this critical moment for Thailand by beating drums and gongs and chanting blessings. This was not celebration, though. Thailand is still in mourning for the much-loved King Bhumibol, and there is uncertainty, even apprehension, over how his son will perform. The new king will devote much of his first few months on the throne presiding over the elaborate rituals leading up to his father's cremation next year. These are important symbolic tasks for the new ruler, who will need to rely on the late king's popularity as he establishes himself. In the past, questions have been quietly raised over his temperament and his fitness to rule. But many Thais will be relieved to see the succession proceeding smoothly and will be wishing him well. Thailand's monarchy is wealthy and influential. The country's future will, to a large extent, depend on how the institution is led. Jonathan Head, BBC News, Bangkok.
Now, Bolivia has suspended the operating licence of LaMaya, the charter airline whose plane crashed in Colombia on Monday, killing 71 people. The plane, which ran out of fuel, had taken off from Santa Cruz in Bolivia en route to Medellin, with players from Brazil's Chapecoense football team among the passengers. Well, you can see some of them here in this video. The last images taken of the squad filmed before the plane took off. Well, in the last few hours, a Brazilian military cargo plane has landed in Medellin to help repatriate the victims, while back in Brazil, fans of Chapecoense continue to gather at the team's stadium to pay their tributes.
I
know that this is not going to be the end. It was a team that marked the lives of every one of us who were here. Beyond their humility, they were practically part of our family, because as organised fans, we went with them everywhere.
We
as part of the Chapecoense family are more than just a team, it's our family. We're going through a very hard time, but this moment came so that we can grow.
Well, 3 Chapecoense football players and a journalist were among the survivors. A spokesperson for the football team gave this update on how they're doing.
The condition of the 4 survivors, of the 3 athletes and also journalist Rafael Hensel, are serious. The one in the most serious condition is goalkeeper Jackson Foreman. They are all stable and at this time without risk of death.
To Syria now and the ongoing battle for the city of Aleppo. It's estimated that nearly 500,000 people have now fled between fighting of government forces and rebel groups. And the UN has criticised Russia for not allowing aid into areas of the city where people are desperate for food and medical supplies. Our correspondent Richard Galpin now reports.
Pro-government forces are pushing deeper and deeper into rebel-held territory in Aleppo. Their offensive has momentum, and they've now been attacking the southern part of the key rebel enclave. But opposition fighters have been hitting back. desperately trying to hold on to what remains of their stronghold in the city, which has been in their hands for years. The rebel-held area marked in grey on this map has already shrunk dramatically in recent days, with much of the northern part now in government hands. And as the offensive continues, there's speculation the rebels could be pushed out of the city altogether within weeks. The collapse of the rebel front lines under intense bombardment has led to around 30,000 civilians fleeing, many crossing into government-held areas where they can get food and medicine. But the fate of the men arriving here is unknown. Meanwhile, for those still living inside the rebel enclave, life is increasingly desperate. Hundreds of casualties, no medicine, not even anaesthetics for surgery, and very little food. Today, the United Nations said the total number of people in need of help in Aleppo was overwhelming.
400,000 in the internally displaced in western Aleppo are now joined by tens of thousands or more. We need a winter program for them. Europe panicked because we got 400,000 from Syria, all of Europe. West Aleppo has that alone.
One possible answer to this crisis now being discussed is to create humanitarian corridors to allow the sick and injured to leave eastern Aleppo and to send in supplies of food and medicine to the area. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
Now, here in the UK, the latest official estimates show that the number of people arriving in Britain up to June has risen to its highest ever level. The Office of National Statistics say there were 650,000 immigrants in the 12 months to the end of June this year, the highest number yet. When you take away the number of people leaving, the total migration figure is 335,000, a near record and well below the government's target. Well, meanwhile, the Minister for Exiting the EU, David Davis, has said that ministers would consider paying to retain access to the single market. The BBC's political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, looks at the view from the UK.
Every week, we send £350 million to Brussels.
What did the country vote for? More power for our government, but for many, the promise of cash that's spent by the EU being spent by us. But for the first time, a senior minister has confirmed, even after we've left the union, we might still pay in.
Will the government consider making any contribution in any shape or form for access to the single market?
The major criterion here is that we get the best possible access for goods and services to the European market. And if that is included in what he's talking about, then of course we would consider it.
Remember, ministers aren't meant to be giving anything away. But he's not the only one staring into the vacuum. He was backed by the Chancellor this afternoon. Our membership right now costs $11 billion a year. But after Brexit, we might pay for the single market to trade freely around the continent, or to remain part of research and science projects, for example. And there'll be exit costs too, like the pensions of EU staff. Brexit! But that wasn't quite what many voters bargained for. And some MPs who campaigned to leave would fight it tooth and claw.
People would be absolutely outraged if we came out of the EU and then carried on paying them 15 billion a year, 10 billion a year, or whatever the figure is. No, I don't think that's going to happen. But I mean, obviously, in that very, very hypothetical case, of course, people will be exceptionally upset about it. It's just not going to happen.
But should we keep paying something to the EU if it means we'd prosper? Labour isn't yet sure.
We were promised no running commentary, so we've got that. That's the first broken promise. The idea of paying for access, I'm not really sure what that means.
Too quick.
The government never gave up on photo opportunities, but had intended to keep quiet on plans for Brexit. But piece by piece, ministers are starting to reveal what they might do. Laura Kuenssberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Now, we just want to bring you some breaking news, which has just happened this hour on BBC World News. Francois Hollande, the President of France, has decided not to put his hat in the ring of the presidential race coming up in France. So he will not be standing as a candidate for the next presidential election in France. Now, the child sex abuse scandal engulfing British football is deepening. A helpline set up for victims has received almost 900 calls in its first week. The children's charity which is running the service, the NSPCC, described the numbers as staggering. More than 60 cases have been referred to the police, and about 350 people have come forward to say that they were victims of child sexual abuse in football clubs. Our sports editor, Dan Rowan, reports.
The appointment of a New England manager usually leads to questions about teams and tactics, but with the sport engulfed in an escalating sex abuse scandal, Gareth Southgate today knew he had to face it head-on.
I played with one of the players who's recently come forward, and the reality of that, as they have said, is that they haven't felt able to speak about that until this moment. I think the world was very different 20 years ago. I think it is important we acknowledge that and learn from it. And I repeat, I think a lot of those lessons have already been learned, because that's why the situation we have now in terms of child protection looks completely different.
The scale of this scandal is remarkable. Around 350 victims have reported child sexual abuse within UK football clubs to the police. Greater Manchester Police alone have identified 10 suspects, and the NSPCC's dedicated helpline has confirmed it received over 860 calls in its first week.
We're frankly staggered at the number of calls that have been made to this dedicated NSPCC helpline since it was set up a week ago. It is unprecedented in our experience of setting up a helpline like this to get so many calls in such a short period of time.
Several people have told the BBC that they were abused by this man, former North West-based football coach Frank Roper, who died in 2005. Jason Dunford says he was one of Roper's victims while a youth player, and told me today how he felt having learned about his abuser's death.
He was so aggressive. He was certainly one that had to be brought to justice. I was angry at first, and now I'm looking at the positive. Now I've slept on it, I'm looking at the positives of him not being able to affect my life or anyone else's life anymore.
Meanwhile, it's emerged that Chelsea in the last 3 years made a payment to a former youth player who claimed he was abused by the club's chief scout in the 1970s. An internal inquiry's been launched amid reports other big clubs may have made similar payments. When asked about the consequences of clubs engaging in any cover-ups, the FA was clear.
We have clear laws and rules in the game that need to be followed, and if there's been any evidence of a breach of those, so hushing up would be one. Subject to due process, i.e. the police need to be the right place in this. When it's our turn to apply the rules, we absolutely will.
Today, former Newcastle United footballer David Eatook told the BBC he was abused by the club's former youth coach George Ormond, who was jailed in 2002 for indecent assault.
There's a lot of shame, a lot of guilt attached. A lot of confusion, and like I said, it was just impossible at that time to come out. Just impossible.
And with more players set to come forward, the appalling secret that British football appears to have harboured for so long is finally being exposed. Dan Rowan, BBC News.
Now, during the US election campaign, Donald Trump promised more jobs for Americans, and he specifically pledged to keep manufacturing jobs in the country. Well, today, he and Vice President-elect Mike Pence are going to be visiting a factory in Indiana that became a centerpiece of Donald Trump's jobs plan. There you can see the empty stadium there where the two men are supposed to be due to speak in a minute. Well, joining me now to discuss while we wait for President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect Pence is Michelle Fleury in New York. Michelle, good to see you. Just run us through what Mr. Trump managed to do over there in Indiana.
Well, it all started back in February when a video went viral showing a Carrier employee telling staff that the factory was essentially shutting down, moving jobs to Mexico. President-elect Trump at the time on the campaign trail said that he would do what he could to stop this happening, and seemingly he's made good on that promise, because over the last 48 hours we've seen an announcement from the company saying that 1,000 jobs were saved. What we're waiting to find out a bit more in terms of detail is how those jobs were saved. It's worth noting that this company which makes air conditioners is actually based in the state where Mike Pence is the outgoing governor. We know he was heavily involved in the negotiations with the company, which is owned by United Technologies, and there were some incentives involved. How much of a factor that was in the company's decision-making based on what they've said seems to have played quite a role. But they also said in their statement that they were keen to work with the government to try and maintain and keep jobs here in America.
You're quite right, Michelle. The detail on this will be quite interesting because if concessions were made to Carrier, Mr. Trump during the campaign did criticise President Obama for promising tax breaks for companies to keep jobs in the US. So essentially, he might be doing what he was criticising others for.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things that are striking here. One is the idea that there was perhaps taxpayer money that was used to kind of keep the company in the state. The other aspect is that you're seeing someone who's a businessman who has said he'd bring his know-how of art of negotiating a deal to the White House. Now he's using the White House to try and have an impact on corporate decisions, not just through tweets and through what he said on social media, but also in terms of the negotiations that have taken place. And we've seen this play out not just with Carrier, but already in recent weeks also there were tweets about Ford, the Ford Motor Company, whether or not it was going to save jobs. Now, as it turned out, it wasn't a case of saving jobs, but what Trump did achieve was saving the production of one particular vehicle at a plant. It's going to sort of be interesting to see how this carries on once he's in office. Will this be part of a pattern, part of the way he does business?
Michelle, thanks very much. Good to talk to you. That's Michelle Fleury in New York for us. Now, let's go back to that breaking story from Paris. President Francois Hollande has just announced that he will not be seeking re-election as the socialist candidate in next year's election. Well, our correspondent Hugh Schofield is in Paris for us now. Hugh, good to see you. Francois Hollande is not standing, potentially because he might have been looking at the latest approval ratings for himself.
Well, that's certainly part of it. It is a first in the Fifth Republic that a sitting president who's not been incapacitated by illness or anything else has stepped down like this. And it is a recognition, I suppose, that he knows that he's a very unpopular leader, that he would have very, very small chances of success. And above all, that he would risk, really splitting open his own Socialist Party, and it would mean that the last 5-6 months of his mandate would be a complete mess as the Socialist Party tore itself apart with him against his own Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, and so on. So I think it's a wise decision on his part. That's certainly how it's being interpreted here, and it allows him sort of to leave with his head held high-ish. And in his address this evening, he did enunciate the various achievements that he thinks that he's won in his presidency, and let us do him honor. I mean, there was the Environmental Agreement of Paris a year ago. There's gay marriage. There are economic reforms, but I think above all, it's this issue of unemployment, which has been an absolute killer for him. I mean, right at the beginning, he went, he looked the country in the eye and said, "I promise you, in a year it'll start coming down." A year went by, it didn't start coming down. He said it again in 2 years, and these were such solemn promises he made that if he'd gone for another mandate now, these would have come back to haunt him big time. And even though he's now saying that this unemployment does begin to look as if it's going to come down, I mean, everyone knows that's not what he meant at the start. He meant that he would really get on top of unemployment, and he did not. It's got significantly worse.
Thank you very much, Hugh. That's Hugh Schofield there in Paris for us there with the news that Francois Hollande will not be standing in the next elections in France. Well, it's time to take you for a look at some of the day's other news now. An ethnic cleansing is underway in several parts of South Sudan, according to the UN, which has visited the country. The officials said that forced starvation, gang rape and the burning of villages were among tactics used. President Salva Kiir has strongly denied that ethnic cleansing is taking place. The French government has been accused of undermining free speech after it introduced a bill to penalise websites that discourage pregnant women from seeking abortions. The bill is being debated in the National Assembly. France has already banned demonstrations by anti-abortion activists outside hospitals and clinics. The second man on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, has been evacuated from the South Pole after falling ill. The 86-year-old former astronaut was visiting Antarctica as part of a private tour group. He was airlifted to an American research base and is now in hospital in New Zealand. His condition is being described as stable. Now, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has spoken of his hopes of a renewed relationship with the United States following the election of President-elect Trump. So long as it's on an equal footing. Mr. Putin has been making his annual State of the Nation address in Moscow. He also warned that attempts to undermine his country could, as he said, lead to a global catastrophe. Well, meanwhile, on Russia's border, Ukraine has begun testing missiles near the annexed region of Crimea. A Security Council chief said in a statement that it was important for Ukraine to test the air defense systems, which he said had been targeted by Russian agents for many years. Meanwhile, France expressed concern at the buildup of Russian ships in the Black Sea as a response. Now, Rashida Dati has risen to become one of the most high-profile yet controversial female politicians in France. The former presidential advisor served as justice minister under Nicolas Sarkozy, returning to work just 5 days after giving birth to her daughter. Well, as part of the BBC's 100 Women season, she's been speaking to my colleague Yalda Hakim about women's rights and why she has no sympathy for Hillary Clinton.
Mais ça devrait nous interroger pourquoi les Américains veulent voter pour Trump. Moi, c'est ça qui m'interroge.
Do you think that Hillary Clinton has come under scrutiny and pressure from the media and different sectors and from men because she is a woman in the public eye?
Alors, et pourtant je suis féministe. Je ne le crois pas parce que Hillary Clinton est très privilégiée. Elle est très privilégiée. Elle a vécu dans des milieux très privilégiés dont elle connaît tous les codes, dont elle connaît parfaitement le système. C'est pas une pauvre femme qui est attaquée. Donc cet argument peut exister, mais je pense qu'il est très minoritaire. Je pense que ceux qui ne veulent pas d'Hillary Clinton, c'est pas parce qu'elle est une femme.
Do you think that the conversation around women in power is shifting? We're at a turning point, given the number of women who are in powerful positions, Angela Merkel, Hillary Clinton, Christine Lagarde. Do you think this conversation around women breaking the glass ceiling is shifting now?
Alors moi, ce que j'aimerais, si j'ai un message à faire passer par votre émission, c'est que toutes ces femmes que vous avez vues et que vous interviewez, et j'en connais certaines, c'est que quand elles sont au pouvoir, qu'elles ne se servent pas de la cause des femmes uniquement pour être élues, qu'elles ne se servent pas de la cause des femmes juste pour pouvoir accéder au pouvoir. Moi, je veux qu'on défende celles qui sont menacées de mort. Celles qui sont menacées de mort juste parce qu'elles veulent avoir une liberté de femme, elles veulent avoir un enfant, elles veulent se marier avec qui elles veulent se présenter aux élections, elles ne veulent pas être enfermées dans une burqa. Je voudrais que ces femmes-là se mobilisent pour celles-là et qu'elles ne se mobilisent pas que entre elles. Parce que sinon, elle va avoir le défaut des hommes. Aujourd'hui, quand on combat les hommes qui veulent garder les postes de pouvoir, parce que les hommes, même s'ils se détestent, ils sont solidaires entre eux pour pas qu'il y ait de femmes. Et bien moi, je ne veux pas que ces femmes soient solidaires entre elles uniquement pour garder le pouvoir. Je veux qu'elles soient solidaires pour que les autres femmes puissent juste avoir la liberté de vivre. Et j'invite ces femmes à aller en Arabie Saoudite, à aller en Afghanistan, à aller en Irak, à aller en Libye, et de voir ce qu'est la condition des femmes. Et des femmes qui se battent, des femmes qui veulent faire des études, des femmes qui veulent aller, des petites filles qui veulent aller à l'école. Et bien moi j'aimerais que ces femmes de pouvoir que vous avez citées, Christine Lagarde, Hillary Clinton et d'autres, se battent pour ces femmes-là. Parce que ces femmes-là, elles se battent que pour leur pouvoir. Ça me gêne. Je sais que c'est pas politiquement correct ce que je dis, mais c'est une réalité.
Now, a reminder of that breaking news we brought you here on World News Today. François Hollande has stunned France by declaring he will not seek a second term as President of France. Mr. Hollande faced a very low popularity rating. Let's hear what he said a little earlier.
Mais le pouvoir, l'exercice du pouvoir, les lieux du pouvoir.
But power, the exercise of power, the places where power is vested and all that power brings, none of these things have left me losing sight of reality. Neither about myself nor the wider situation, so I must act. And today I am aware of the inherent risks which surround power, and so I have decided I will not be a candidate in the presidential election, nor will I seek a new mandate as president.
Au renouvellement donc de mon mandat.
That was Francois Hollande speaking a little earlier. Just to say, he will be the first French sitting president in French history not to seek re-election there. So Francois Fillon or Marine Le Pen, you'd have to say now, are front runners in next year's election in France. Well, that's all from me and the team. You can get in touch with me on Twitter. I'm at Tom Donkin BBC. But for now, stay with us and we'll see you next time. Goodbye for now.